Hey everybody, and welcome to chapter number 3. We're talking about the biological basis of behavior, which is a really fancy way of saying that we're talking about the brain and the nervous system for this chapter. It's kind of I always think of these first few chapters as building blocks. Like, we have to be able to understand what psychology is to really talk about psychology. We need to be able to talk about how it's measured, which we did last chapter, to talk about what we know in psychology. And in chapter 3 we're talking about a lot of the anatomy and a lot of the fundamental processes that allow behavior to occur. So we're going to be getting nitty-gritty to a degree with the brain and the nervous system, but we're also going to kind of keep this light. We're going to keep this, I almost said surface level, which is totally inaccurate because of all the chapters. This is the most interior one. This is what happens inside your skull and beneath your skin, so it's not surface level at all. But what I mean about that is that the brain is incredibly complex. And I joke with my classes sometimes that you hear philosophers or other academics talk about how complex and mysterious and wonderful the brain is. I've heard physicists refer to the brain as, one of the most complex structures in the known universe. And I always feel a little bit like that's quite the ego that our brains have to tell us that our brains are the most complex, complicated, hardest working organs, right? How do we know that? Because our brain tells us so. All right, so let's get into it. So today what we're going to be talking about is how much of our behavior is biological in nature. We'll be talking about the nervous system, and we're going to be talking about the structure of the neuron. These are all subjects that may come up in your other classes. So if you've taken human anatomy and physiology or biology class, some of the stuff is going to be a little bit familiar to you, or dating back to your high school science classes, you may have talked about some of these things. We'll also be talking about the structure of the brain. We'll look at a very quick history of brain research, but we'll more specifically look at some of the key areas of the brain and what their major functions are. So I got a couple of videos for you today. The ones, there's one video that I feel like is like a must watch, and I think I'm gonna try to show it in this video because I think it's that important. But these other ones I think are interesting. So these two videos are both videos about brain myths, and so some of those I'm going to be touching on in this chapter, and then some of them are just going to be things that you'll hear me talk about throughout the semester. But like, for example, you'll hear people say that humans only use 10 or 15% of our brain. What happens if we unlock the potential of the other 80% of the brain, or 85% of the brain? You may have seen that before, and it happens in movies and in stories and books and whatever. That's all nonsense. Like, that's not how the brain works, and I don't know where that information came from, but it's one of those urban legends that people think of and think is true. So these videos kind of speak to that and kind of talk about some of those common myths in case you're interested in that. So let's get into it. If you're curious about what you're looking at right here, these are images from an MRI. Specifically, this is an fMRI. fMRI meaning functional magnetic resonance imaging. And here what we're seeing is a regular MRI. You'll note that it does not have the lowercase f. That means that it is a non-functional, which means that it's specifically looking at the structure of the brain. That might be something a little bit more detailed than what you need to know for this class, but just in case you're interested, let's get into it. So we're talking about biology and behavior. This is one of those big ideas that we talked about at the very beginning of the semester, right? When we talked about nature versus nurture. How much of our behavior is because of our biology? How much of it is because of our genes? How much of it is because of our inheritance? That is different than how much of our behavior is because of what we have experienced and what we have learned. So this chapter is going to be looking kind of at the nature side of things. How much of what we have learned comes from those innate processes we're born with. So psychology is the study of living organisms, and I didn't say people, right? And the reason why is for a couple of reasons. One is because we don't need to limit it to people. Behavior spans not just people, but also non-human animals. My dog who's over there sleeping in the corner, he's behaving right now. He is sleeping. That sleeping is a behavior, as we will see in future chapters. But I'm mentioning living here because, and the other reason why I didn't mention people is because my background is actually, like, when I was in grad school, I did not work with humans. My research was with pigeons and looking at other non-human species. So my background is, a lot of it is in non-human research. These days it isn't. These days I do research with humans. But I carry that with me, and that's kind of my bias, is that I get a little bit defensive whenever people think about psychology as being purely about just people, because it's about so much more than that. It's about not just gorillas and other primates and dogs, for example, and dolphins and these other kind of higher organisms, but it's also for amoebas, those tiny little germ-like creatures that exist, newts, salamanders, lizards, whales, porpoises, fish, worms, any kind of living organism. Well, depends. Are we going to say a plant is an organism? Do plants behave? Well, I think we would probably maybe argue that a Venus flytrap behaves, right? What about a sunflower, which kind of changes its direction based on where the sun is? Are those behaviors? I don't know. That's a really good question. Do we classify reflexes as behaviors? I think that we generally do classify reflexes as behavior, but not as a learned behavior. And I'm getting ahead of myself because we're going to be talking about that in chapter 6. But the point of that is that, the point of me bringing this up is that so much of our experience can be classified as behavior. In grad school, I had a friend who he liked to say that a behavior is anything that a corpse can't do. For example, a corpse can't sleep, so sleeping is a behavior. A corpse can't breathe, so breathing is a behavior. A corpse can decay, so decaying is not a behavior. So an interesting thing that we are going to see in the next couple of chapters is that whenever we learn something, we change. And I don't mean that in a symbolic, metaphoric way that, whenever you learn something, you change symbolically. Spiritually, you change in some way. No, I mean like physiologically you change to a degree. That whenever you learn something, and your behavior has changed because you've learned something, that results in a physiological change to your nervous system. Something about your nervous system and your brain has changed, and that has led to a change in your behavior. But this is kind of a two-way street. So we can say that, for example, if I had a traumatic brain injury and that resulted in a difference in my personality. You've probably seen examples of this on television, or you may even know people in your life that had some kind of blow to the head and it resulted in a change in their behavior. There we go. We see a connection between the nervous system and our behavior. But the reverse is also true, that whenever you change your behavior, you are also changing the wiring of your brain. And so whenever you go into a classroom and you learn something, then, hey, look, my other dog is joining us, and I think he's going underneath the desk. Or maybe not. He's just smiling at me for some reason. He gets excited when I talk about the nervous system. He didn't want to miss this. But whenever you go in and you learn something, anytime you learn something, your brain is going to rewire itself subtly in order to accommodate that experience. We're going to see this at the very end of the chapter when we talk about neuroplasticity, that neurons can change their shape and what they fire or when they fire based on our experiences. Okay, so let's go ahead and get into it. We can unpack this phrase right here, these bullet points. We could spend an entire semester kind of breaking that down. And in fact, I should point out, anytime we start a new chapter, that a lot of these chapters can be their own classes. This being one of them. This is usually referred to as behavioral neuroscience, which is offered usually in our department by Dr. Princey Manella. So if you're interested in behavioral neuroscience, that is a class. If you like this chapter, this is a class you can do a really deep dive on and learn more about. Let's talk about the role of nature now. So when we talk about where behavior comes from, we can talk about nature versus nurture. And I've already kind of spoiled this by talking about how it's really a mix of these things. That it's not just nature and it's not just nurture, that when we are behaving, it is a mixture of these things. Part of it is what we have inherited, it is part of our DNA, and then the other part of it is going to be what we have learned and what we have experienced. And the question is, well, how do we actually test that, right? You may remember in chapter 1 when I was talking about this, I mentioned that it's really hard to tease apart these kinds of questions. But I have a really fascinating case study for you. But it does involve the mistreatment of animals, so I am going to warn you about that. So, just a heads up for that in case you're a little bit squeamish about animals, the next 5 minutes, we're going to be talking about the history of that mistreatment. And it is an important thing to know. So, let's talk about Siberian foxes. So, these foxes, these cute little guys, they don't necessarily look like foxes you might expect over here in New England. Those that I've seen in New England are generally kind of red or brown, right? Silver-tail foxes are, as you can see, a little bit darker. They're black and white and gray. And once upon a time, these foxes were highly valued for these coats, that people loved to capture these foxes, kill them, and then harvest their coats to be used in clothing. But the problem is that foxes are non-domesticated, right? So foxes are wild animals, and so for that reason, you can't really capture them and raise them like they're livestock. They just won't cooperate with that. They hate it. They will attack you. They're not like cows or pigs where, you know, if you have a farm with cows on it, cows will just kind of hang around and eat stuff. They're not going to try to actively escape all the time. But for foxes, they will. They don't like being raised in captivity, so they try to escape. They're mean. They don't like it. So that presented a problem. These companies, they wanted to harvest these fur coats, but these foxes are hard to capture, and you can't really raise them in captivity. So what do? Basically, these handlers decided, okay, well, maybe we can find a way to raise a domesticated fox. Maybe we can have them in captivity and raise them to be polite and proper and compliant so that we can kill them and harvest their coats. I know, like I said, this is bad. This is all bad vibes until the very end. Then it becomes good vibes. But we have to deal with the bad stuff first. So this goes on. It turns out to not really work. That it doesn't matter if you have if you have a wild fox and that wild fox gives birth to a litter of pups, that those pups are still wild, that they are not going to like being raised in captivity just because that's all they've known. They're going to hate it still. So what these handlers did is that they started breeding these foxes based on their disposition. That they would look at a litter of pups and they would say, okay, let's say out of these 10, these 2 right here are relatively nice. So we're going to take these 2 and we're going to put them in this pool of other nice foxes. And these other 8, we'll keep them on the farm. But what we're really interested right now is breeding these 2 with these other nice foxes. So they basically went through all these litters and started picking out the nicest foxes of each batch and then letting them have opportunities to mate, and then they would take those litters and then pick out the nicest ones and do the same thing over and over. So basically they're looking at, out of this litter of pups, we're only going to really try to focus on the nice ones and let them interbreed with other nice pups from other litters. Here is the results of that study. So let me pop over to this video. Here we go.
There is a scale for the behavior with minus and plus. And team 1 has plus behavior. They can approach your hands. They have no fear. And there is always a minus behavior when they see it's afraid.
Okay, so sorry. So basically, I know it's really hard to hear what they're saying, but basically what they're getting at is that they're going to show you two sets of foxes. One of these foxes is from generations of nice foxes being bred with other nice foxes, and the other fox is what they call the minus behavior, which is foxes that were not selected for their nice traits, that they just come from a regular wild litter. Importantly, both sets of foxes that you see have both been raised in captivity all their lives. So the only thing different about them will be their DNA, will be their inherited traits. Everything else is going to be the same. They were both raised in these really harsh, conditions with these cages. Like I said, it's a huge bummer. So think about how this fox reacted. They're standing right in front of it, and then gauge that with how the other fox reacts.
And see, it's afraid.
And here, if you're listening to the sound, what you're hearing is it's blowing out air as like a warning sign, and also snapping at the camera whenever it gets close.
It's very interesting that aggressive ones have very high attention span.
Yeah.
When they see a lot of people, they have a fear.
Right.
But when they see one people, they try to defeat them, to attack them.
Yeah. 'Cause there's too many people.
Well, even one human is enough when you open the cage.
Yeah.
Because
They're too afraid.
it's too much of the stress.
Yeah.
As you can see, this fox does not like this. He tries to get away. Very upsetting, I know. Now here are the foxes that were selected based on their parents being domestic foxes, or nice foxes, I should say.
See, and different eyes.
Yeah, one eye is...
Learn.
Yeah, it's more tame. I think 3, maybe plus 3. You can take him on hands too.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Чтобы они инфицировались. То есть, если, например, за агрессивность недостаточно просто присутствия человека, он никуда сразу не то для этих, например, если посадить, когда вот
All right, so I'm going to cut it there. So what are we looking at here? Like I said, that these foxes, that they were both raised in captivity. That both of these foxes, the nice ones, quote unquote, and the wild ones, both had the exact same experiences throughout their life. The only thing that's different is that their parents, for the domestic group, were selected based on their nice human-centric behaviors, and we can see that has a huge effect on their behavior, right? That the foxes that were bred for being quote-unquote nice, having those kind of domestic kind of traits, they kind of act like dogs, right? That they seem like they're happy, that they pant, they roll over on their backs and play just like dogs do. That they wag their tails and things like that. And so the reason why I said that this has a happy ending at the very end is that this video, as you saw, was recorded in 2011. Since this time, essentially they've stopped trying to raise these foxes to harvest their coats, because what these companies found is that it's much more profitable for them to be able to raise foxes that are domesticated to sell them as pets around the world. And so you can go on YouTube and you can search silver-tail domestic fox, and you can see people who have just these adorable foxes with these big floppy ears and wagging tails that they live with, that they act kind of like dogs. So this is kind of a profound thing, right? Like that what we're seeing here is the effect of nature. right? If we're talking about nature versus nurture, as I said in the very first chapter, the very first chapter, that generally as psychologists we are biased to like the nurture side of things, that we like to know that your experiences change your behavior and that you learn from your experiences. But this shows, this set of experiments shows that we can't ignore nature, that there's a huge impact on our behavior that seems to come from whatever genes and DNA we have inherited. All right, and this just kind of goes over what I was, what I just said, all this info, so I'm going to skip over that. All right, so now is a good time to take a quick break. If you want to Google more of those videos about those domesticated foxes, last time I checked, I want to say that they cost about $6,000 if you wanted to buy one. So it's kind of a steep price, so you might want to put that on your Christmas list or something like that. I don't know, unless you got that kind of money to be throwing around. I don't know, maybe you do. I don't, and pretty much every year for Christmas my wife asks, can we get a domestic fox? Which is why my dog that came in, he looks kind of like a fox, because I was like, hey, check out this mutt. He's close enough, right? All right, so let's get into the nervous system. So the nervous system is the building block of all behavior. That you don't have behavior without the neuron, and the neuron is the basic component that creates our nervous system. So our nervous system is just a collection of these cells that are neurons, and neurons are fascinating because they can communicate with other cells very efficiently, and based on their histories they can actually change how they respond in the future. So let's talk about the neuron, and then we'll also talk about the different kinds of nervous system. So we do have a nervous system, but our nervous system, because it deals with so many different kinds of behaviors, there are different kinds of subsystems within that bigger broad system. All right, so let's take a look first at the nervous systems, then we'll kind of backtrack and talk about these neurons. So first, let's talk about the peripheral nervous system right here. So we'll talk about the central nervous system pretty much throughout the rest of the semester. So I want to make some time to talk about the peripheral nervous system. What is the difference between these two? The central nervous system is central. It is the brain and it is the spinal column. Everything else is going to be the peripheral nervous system. So let's take a look at the peripheral nervous system first. So the peripheral nervous system has two subsystems to it. You got the peripheral nervous system, and within that you have the somatic nervous system and you have the autonomic nervous system. The somatic nervous system is kind of like, should I use this word? I'm going to say, you can think of it as the controllable nervous, as the voluntary nervous system. What I'm trying to get at is that this is the part of your nervous system that is responsible for movement and for grabbing things and for feeling things. And like, if I am tying my shoes, I'm doing that with my somatic nervous system. That this involves feedback from my skin, from my muscles, and from my joints, and my ability to control all of those things. So my somatic nervous system is this. If we had an issue with my somatic nervous system, then I could be totally fine with breathing. I could be totally fine with temperature regulation, but I would not be fine with movement, with actually picking up a pencil and being able to write with it. The autonomic nervous system, on the other hand, is kind of like it sounds, is kind of the more automatic nervous system. It is the kind of stuff that you typically don't voluntarily handle. So these are going to be kind of internal mechanisms like your ability to notice that you're hungry, or your ability to notice that you are in pain, or that you are stressed, or that you are relaxed or sleepy. These are all things that happen from the central nervous system. So here is kind of a breakdown. So we got our central nervous system over here, but we also have the peripheral over here, and then we have, like I mentioned, the controllable aspects of it, where you're kind of talking about your skin, your muscles, and your joints. But then we also have the autonomic system, which is where we're going to talk about the fight or flight responses, if you've heard of that before. Well, I know you've heard of the fight or flight response before, right? basically the idea is that whenever you are, sorry, I jumped the gun. I thought it was the next slide where we were going to break that down. Basically, whenever you encounter something scary, something that might threaten your life, you are going to have essentially two broad classifications of action. You can either fight, which is that you're going to take it on, or you are going to flight. You're going to run away. Sometimes people will throw freezing in, as one of the F's here, fight, flight, or freeze. But I think a lot of people just will categorize freeze as flight as well. It's your system not directly engaging with that threatening substance. We'll talk more about that in just a second. So that fight or flight response is going to be kind of handled by the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. So the sympathetic nervous system is going to be whenever you are preparing your body for action, where you're getting ready to do something, whether that be tackle your problem head on or running away from it. So let's say if a grizzly bear walked into this door right now, what would I do? I would have, for just a moment, I would have this response where it's like, oh, I either need to jump out of this window right here to escape, or I can throw up some fists and try to punch this grizzly bear and I can fight it. So in the first case, that was me using this flight response, and then in the second, I'm using the fight response. And we see this also, and this is very literal here, but this applies to a lot of parts of our everyday life. Like, let's say if you play sports and you get really stressed out, like I can give you an example from my very first football game. I was on special teams receiving, and very first kickoff of the season. I had trained all summer, and the ball goes up, lands right in front of me. Amazing. I run, I catch it, or I scoop it up off the ground, and I totally freeze up, and I'm just like, oh my God, what do I do now? I see people running at me. Do I turn around or do I run at them? I don't know. And that freezing behavior where I kind of chickened out and then got tackled and fumbled the ball, that was me engaging in flight, where I was like, oh, I don't know what to do. I'm kind of worried. I'm kind of scared. I'm really stressed out. What do I do? If I was better at football, at that moment, I would have scooped it up, and then I would have immediately been like, all right, I have to do this. I'm going to run forward. I'm going to fight. So in that case, I have a similar kind of initial stress response. That feeling where I'm preparing for action, whether or not I'm going to directly go towards the threatening thing, or if I'm going to turn around and run away from it, either way, that preparation that our body undergoes is the sympathetic division of our nervous system. After that, after I screwed up and then, went over to the sidelines for the first half of the game to sit on the bench, then I went through the parasympathetic part of my nervous system where I rest and digest it. That is the parasympathetic system, where you're essentially returning back to homeostasis, where you're trying to go back to normal. So this is where you're going to kind of involuntarily rest. You get tired and you want to slow down. That's the parasympathetic system. So when we talk about arousal in this class, I feel like the word arousal generally is referring to kind of sexual things, but that's not really what we mean here when we say arousal. Arousal is kind of like how activated is your nervous system at this time. So in that moment where I'm scooping up the football, I'm highly aroused because I am very stressed out and I feel threatened and I am very prepped for action. So the more aroused you are, the greater your sympathetic nervous system is going to be. So here is kind of a breakdown between these two. So let's look just at the sympathetic division first. When this is engaged, this fight or flight response, we see these things happening. We see our pupils are going to dilate. Our pupils are going to get wider. They're going to let in more light so that we can see more of our available surrounding areas. They're going to increase our heartbeat so we can increase the blood flow throughout the body. It's going to relax the airways so that we can take in huge lungfuls of air. It's going to inhibit activity of the stomach, so it's going to stop digesting things because your body's going to want to conserve energy for other things like fighting or running away. It's going to inhibit other digestive things happening in your intestines, and it can even result in things like you evacuating your bowels to try to why do we evacuate our bowels when we are scared? It's because that's essentially your body is very pragmatically like, that's one less thing we got to worry about. We don't have to hold it anymore. We don't have time to hold it. We're just going to go, so that way it's one less thing that we have to conserve energy worrying about. So that is the fight or flight response. If we look at the other version, the rest and digest response that is handled by the parasympathetic nervous system, we can see that it's essentially the opposite, where we have our pupils are going to constrict, our pupils are going to get smaller to let in less light. We're going to start to salivate. We're going to spend some energy salivating. We're going to slow our heartbeat because we don't have to pump so much blood. We are going to start digesting things again. Because now we have the energy to do that. We don't have to worry about running away. And so these two things are kind of in balance, that they kind of work, kind of with each other to get us through our everyday. All right, so those are the divisions of the nervous system. Now let's take a quick look at the neuron, because the neuron is going to be what this nervous system is made out of. So whenever I think of neurons, I think of communication, and part of that is because in the other classes that I teach in the psych major, I teach cognitive psychology and sensation and perception. Those are kind of like my two specialties. They don't let anybody else teach those, only me, they're mine. But those classes both deal a lot with the brain, and specifically how neurons communicate information throughout the brain. And so when I think of the neuron, I think of a cell that can communicate with other nearby cells. So the way they do that is really fascinating because it's both chemical and electrical. So you may see that would be a really good question on the exam if I were to ask you, hey, do neurons communicate using electrical or chemical signals? And the question is, well, it really depends on what kind of communication we are referring to. If you are a neuron and you are communicating with other neurons, then you are using chemical signals. You need neurotransmitters. That's what those chemicals are. You need neurotransmitters in order to do that. If you are communicating inside the neuron, so just to get from point A to point B inside one neuron, then you are using an electrical signal. We'll go into more detail about that in just a moment. So there are three phases for neural activity, or neuronal activity. They mean the same thing, neuronal. The first, what we have is called reception. This is the neuron is going to be looking out and hungry for incoming neurotransmitters, those chemical signals that we get from neighboring neurons. You get enough of those, and the cell is going to undergo integration. Integration means that you've now kind of evaluated how many chemicals you've gotten. You feel like that's enough, and so you're going to integrate that information, which leads to transmission, which means that now you are going to pass on this signal to the next neuron. So let's take a quick look at the anatomy, because this will, I think, be a little bit easier to talk about when we look at the structure of the neuron. So these are some really, really early drawings of neurons, and this comes from Santiago Ramon. Whoops, I don't know how that happened. Oh, weird. It's like I'm drawing and it does not like this. I'm sorry about this, y'all. I guess I can't draw it out. I can draw down here. Strange. But it's Ramon. Now you can't see it. E. Cajal. So Santiago Ramon y Cajal was a Spanish neuroscientist. A lot of people refer to him as the godfather of neuroscience because he painstakingly looked at tissues of the nervous system through a microscope and would just draw what he saw. And these are some really early drawings of neurons. I should, yeah, and actually if you wait to the end of this video, I'll run and go get a book for Christmas. One Christmas I bought my spouse, because she's more of a neuroscientist than I am, I bought her a book of his drawings, and it's really fascinating. You can buy it for like $20-something on Amazon in case you're curious of it. It's really beautiful artwork this guy has done. Just all the detail that he did is quite remarkable. So a lot of what we know about the neuron comes from Santiago Ramon y Cajal and his early drawings. This is a more kind of modern look of it, where we're looking at the electrical signal stain of a particular neuron. You can see how wild all of these threads are. A lot of dendrites we have going on here. But this is maybe a little bit easier to talk about. We have this more kind of cartoon looking image right here. This is the structure of the neuron. So I'm going to walk through each of these pieces and tell you about what they do. The next slide is going to tell you essentially what the definition of those things are. So if you get curious or need to slow down, feel free to look ahead to look at, some of those brief descriptions. So let's walk through this together. So the first thing that our neuron is going to deal with is our dendrites. These are branch-like structures that are looking for neurotransmitters. So all of these branches you can see right here, those are all dendrites. All of this right here, those are dendrites for that cell. So these are like branches of a tree, and they are hungry for neurotransmitters. They're looking for neurotransmitters coming from other neurons. And if they get enough of those neurotransmitters, like dopamine or serotonin or acetylcholine or norepinephrine or whatever, you get enough of those, and the cell body is going to make a decision. The cell body, which is sometimes referred to as the soma, it is going to make a decision. It is then going to decide if it is going to fire or not. So the cell body has a nucleus and a mitochondria and all this other stuff, just like you learn about in your biology classes. You get enough of those neurotransmitters, and then now we're going to convert that into an electrical impulse. The way that it does that is it is going to allow in a flood of negative ions, a bunch of sodium ions, which is then followed by a release of potassium ions, which are positively valence. So we have essentially enough of these neurotransmitters results in a depolarization, that this is going to fire off an electrical signal that has a negative electrical charge that is going to zoom down the length of this neuron very, very fast. And as soon as it does that, basically the neuron is then going to correct itself. It let in a bunch of sodium, so now it needs to let in a bunch of potassium to try to balance it out and get it back to a neutral kind of voltage. So this electrical signal is going to travel down the length of this tunnel, which is called the axon. The axon is this tunnel, this long trail here. You can see the axon right here. It's this main highway. Just like here, we would say that this would be, you can see that these, it's a little bit harder to see here, but like kind of these tunnels that spend the longest length, those are the axons. And those axons are going to be covered in these myelin sheaths. These myelin sheaths are layers of fat that are going to help conduct that cell to make sure that we don't lose the signal, essentially. Whenever people have MS, if you remember MS, or you've heard of MS, multiple sclerosis, usually what happens there is that these myelin sheaths begin to degenerate, and it's harder for these neurons to carry out their signal. They can lose their signal much more easily when they're not insulated like this, which creates problems with perception and movement and all other kinds of behaviors. So now that the electrical signal is traveling down the length of this axon, when it gets down to the end here, it reaches the terminal buttons. I've also heard these referred to as the axon terminals. They mean the same thing. The terminal buttons here have pockets of neurotransmitters growing inside them. They're manufactured inside them. So that when the electrical signal reaches the end of these terminal buttons, they are going to open up and release some of those neurotransmitters into the synapse, where they're going to float around and then hopefully get picked up by the next neuron. And then it goes all over again. So the synapse, as you can see here, is not actually a structure. It's actually the gap between these two neurons. That's a common mistake that people make. And then it goes on over again to the next neuron. One thing that I absolutely would love to test you on is this question about the strength of the action potential. The action potential is the electrical signal that is firing out down the length of this neuron. That electrical charge, that is called the action potential. The action potential is always the same voltage. It does not change voltage. So even if you get an overwhelming amount of neurotransmitters over here, it does not change the strength of that action potential, of that electrical impulse. What it does change is how fast this cell fires. If this gets a lot of neurotransmitters, maybe it fires much, much more frequently. And then if it doesn't get any, then it slows down a lot. Either way, the strength of the electrical signal does not change. All right, and then there we go. We have basically all those definitions that I just ran through. Okay, here are some neurotransmitters that would be helpful to know. I don't think I'm going to test you specifically on these on the exam. For the chapter quiz, you may see some of this stuff. This may come up, but I'm not going to ask you about these specifically, with the exception of maybe a couple. Some that are really important. Like, for example, I would say that dopamine. Weird, I'm not sure. Am I still recording? Because I'm getting some issues with, it says I'm still recording, but I'm getting some issues drawing with this. I don't know why. Dopamine, incredibly important. I would say glutamate is really important, and serotonin is really important as well. In fact, all of these are important, but some of these, like dopamine, glutamate, and serotonin, they come up a lot. They're going to come up a lot throughout the semester, and you may have heard of some of these before. Like serotonin, a lot of people usually will talk about that when they talk about their mood, when they talk about being depressed and things like that. And absolutely, serotonin can play a role in that. But you can also see that dopamine plays a function in that as well. So dopamine is also used in mood and in learning. But specifically, usually people will talk about dopamine in terms of reward and in learning things from that. But it gets really, really complicated because, as you can see, well, glutamate is also responsible for learning as well. So, again, like I would say that the most important ones to know are going to be dopamine, glutamate, and serotonin, but I'm not going to expect you to know a lot about them. I'm not going to ask you about the structure of those chemicals or anything like that. All right. So here is a graph looking at the action potential. So here you can see we have an action potential that's hanging out at a pretty typical resting state, which is negative 70 millivolts. And then once we get enough of enough neurotransmitters, in this case brought to us by some stimulus we have introduced, then that is going to depolarize that cell. So you can see that now it is going to fire. We're letting in all these sodium ions, and then that is going to very quickly kind of go back down with potassium flowing in. The thing I wanted to emphasize here is what is referred to as the all or none nature of action potentials. That the action potential, it either fires or it doesn't fire. That there's not different strengths to this action potential. And you can see that here, that whenever this action potential fires, that it is immediately going to go up and then come right back down. There's not going to be cases where it goes up higher than this, and there's not going to be cases that whenever it exceeds this threshold, that it goes up a little bit and then comes back down. It's always going to follow this exact same pattern of going up and down in roughly the same pattern over and over and over, just at different speeds. Here with failed initiations, what that's looking at is like sometimes you might not have enough neurotransmitters to properly fire the cell, fire that neuron. That is totally okay. But yeah, so that is generally that is the action potential. It is an electrical signal that we have, and it is how the neuron communicates within itself, how it lets the other end of that neuron know, hey, we have a message we should send out. That message is a chemical, which we call the neurotransmitters. The all or none principle, another way to think about this is like a flushing toilet. So if you think about a toilet, you press down on the plunger, and once you do, it flushes, right? It doesn't matter if you pressed it really hard or if you just pressed it down all the way very slowly. Either way, it's going to flush all in one go. So it's all or none. It happens or it doesn't happen. Or you can think about like the firing of a gun, right? If you pull the trigger really slowly, it doesn't change how, you know, the strength of the bullet being fired. Or if you press it really fast, it doesn't change it either. It fires or it doesn't fire. All right, other things about neurons. Neurons, the neurotransmitters that we get from those chemical signals can have different kinds of effects on the neurons that they are communicating with. They can be excitatory, so they can increase the likelihood that neuron is going to fire, but they can also be inhibitory, where it tells that neuron, hey, don't fire, or slow down your rate of firing. So an excitatory signal would be one that increases the likelihood of that neuron to fire and carry on its signal. Inhibitory responses are going to be having that cell fire less frequently. And we have this as a constant balance happening throughout throughout our lives as we're experiencing the world. All right, I'm trying to see if there's anything else I want to mention here that I didn't already mention in this graph right here. I don't think so. I think that pretty much covers everything, the big ideas. Here you can see an action potential kind of, moving from cell to cell and how it looks like it's an electrical impulse. And then when it jumps to this next neuron, it does so with neurotransmitters. I already mentioned multiple sclerosis. That is, if you damage your myelin sheaths in your axons, that can lead to behavioral problems. And you can see that this is happening with hundreds of thousands of neurons activated throughout the day, communicating with each other over and over and over and over again. It's truly a miracle that anything happens in our brain because of how complex all of this is. And in fact, it's so complex that typically when we talk about how artificial intelligence works is because people have looked at these cells and thought, well, how can we simulate this with an electrode, with a capacitor on a motherboard or whatever? And we can talk more about that a little bit later when we talk about learning. But yeah, it's extremely complicated, and computing, even though it seems like computers are so much smarter than us, they can react faster than us. But the exact nature of the brain hasn't been replicated with computers yet. We don't have mechanical devices that can work on this small a scale, this reliably, this flexibly, and this fast without constantly breaking. All right, let's talk about the brain. So this would be a great time to take a quick break if you want to, while we enter in the back half of our slides here. And actually, I'm going to take a quick break too. I'm going to get something to drink. So let's take a quick break, and I will be right back. Okay, we are back, and we are talking about the brain. So we're about a little bit more than halfway done with things here. So let's get into it. So when we're talking about the brain, one of the early kind of, I don't know. You know that I love history, so I'm trying to think about where is an appropriate place to start with talking about the brain. Because we can talk about Neanderthals if you want to, like how they thought of the brain and how some Greek philosophers thought of the brain as not really used for much other than cooling the head. They didn't think of it as like this learning center that helps us, store information and house our personalities and things like that. But I would say like more kind of modern approaches to thinking about the brain come to us through phrenology. And if you're not familiar with phrenology is a discredited science, is a pseudoscience. And the idea is that you could feel around on someone's skull, and that could tell you about their personality. That you could rub around on their head, and based on the bumps and lumps on their head, that could tell you about them. It could tell you about their identity and about their personality. That's a bunch of malarkey. It's not true. But, well, hold on. I'm not done trashing phrenology. Another thing about phrenology, so not only was it wrong, but it was also used to justify a lot of discrimination in Europe and in North America, where basically people would, and if you've seen the movie Django Unchained, the Quentin Tarantino movie, there's a monologue that the Leonardo DiCaprio character, he talks about phrenology in this way, as a way to justify discrimination against different classes of people, whether that be working class people or whether that be people of different ethnicities too. And so phrenology has a racist history. It has a very disgraceful history. It's not rooted in science. It's bad. It was not a good thing. Now, with that said, the reason why I'm thinking of it as kind of like the early beginnings of history of modern neuroscience is because it did have one nugget of truth to it. And that nugget of truth is that there are different parts of the brain that do different things for us, that have different specializations. Now, not really to the degree that phrenologists thought that they did, because phrenologists were wrong about this, where, for example, here's a map where for example, they thought like this part right here was where memory was housed, right here above your eyes, and that a little bit above that is the part of your brain that helps you make comparisons, and then above that we have benevolence, so how nice you are, and then over here we have firmness, so how strict are you. And so if you felt on my head, I have a huge lump right here that I got when I was a child with a head injury. This would tell me that I'm a very firm person because this part of my head is bigger, which means that there must be more brain here, which means that I have an overdeveloped sense of firmness. And if I feel like further back here, where my head is a little bit more flat, then I would have a little bit less friendship, maybe that part is less developed in my head. That's kind of what phrenology was after, and that's not true. This whole map is just a bunch of nonsense. None of it's true. It's kind of interesting to look at, right? But it doesn't turn out to really have any kind of roots in science other than just being kind of interesting. But the key thing here is that there are parts of our brain that do different things, that respond differently. That, for example, this part of our brain is for vision. And if we damage this part back here, we would have problems with vision. And for example, this part right here is roughly for memory. This part over here is roughly for complex cognition. This area over here is kind of for our sense of touch and bodily awareness. So there are parts of the brain that specialize in different things, just not really the way they thought about it at all. And it's not really the case either that if you feel someone's head, that their skull shape is going to tell you about their personality. That's also just bullshit. All right, so let's talk about the different layers of this brain. So now that we've gotten kind of the pseudoscience out of the way, let's talk about what these areas actually do. So if we talk about what I call the deep brain structure, or what people call the deep brain structures, these areas that are lower down here, the lower structures are going to be used for a lot of basic survival parts of your body and your nervous system. So thinking about things like breathing, heartbeat, your ability to sweat, those are all things, your ability to stand up straight and not fall over. These are all things that happen, your ability to be angry or scared. These are all things that happen in the deep brain, that happen far down in the deeper elements of the brain, the less evolved parts. And less evolved in the sense that they are more primitive, they are older evolutionarily than the other areas of the brain. If we talk about things like emotion and perception, those are going to be handled by the midbrain over here, so kind of in the middle. And then when we talk about the more kind of complex behaviors, we're more now talking about the cerebral cortex, and we're talking about, in a lot of cases, the prefrontal lobe, or the prefrontal cortex. How do we know all this stuff? A lot of it is because of lesion studies. A lesion study is where you damage some part of your brain, and that leads you unable to perform that behavior anymore. Now, because we didn't have MRIs back then. We didn't have MRIs, we didn't have PET scans, we didn't have, neuroscience and neurosurgery and things like that. And so basically, we learned through case studies where we would find somebody who had a really traumatic brain injury, and we would see how that impacted their behavior, and then we might conclude that this person's brain, the spot where it was injured, that spot must have been responsible for that behavior that is now missing. So there are lots of examples of this throughout psychology's history. Probably the most famous, probably about it, undoubtedly the most famous is a fella named Phineas Gage. Phineas Gage is, we'll talk about him in just a second. Phineas Gage was a railroad worker who essentially lost a huge chunk of his brain in a freak accident and lived. He survived, and even though he had a big chunk of his brain missing, but it may have resulted in behavioral changes. And so psychologists and scientists at the time came to the conclusion that his behavior changed because this part of his brain was gone, which must mean that those parts of his brain that are now gone must have been managing those behaviors that are now missing. We'll get into more detail in just a second. So, transcranial magnetic stimulation is one way that people these days can temporarily create a lesion, where they're temporarily creating part of the brain or turning it off, I guess I should say. And the way this works is through administering a very powerful magnetic field that temporarily kind of scrambles the neurons that handle that part of the brain's communication. So if I put the TMS coil over someone's brain and I turn it on, then they are going to have problems with that behavior. So there are some videos you can find on YouTube where somebody will put that over their speech cortex. And so whenever that person tries to speak, they find that they can't do it because that part of their brain is temporarily deactivated. Really fascinating stuff. And the TMS device, this device right here, which you can see kind of animated right here, is now being used to treat things like depression. So it's used in research, but also has some clinical use as well. I mentioned Phineas Gage because he's one of, a very notable case study in psychology. He was a railroad worker who was, and this, if you're squeamish, heads up, warning, because this is kind of nasty. He had this pole, which you see right here, which was used to tamp down gunpowder or blasting powder to blow up parts of the terrain to make way for railroads. And he put down some blasting powder, and then he drove the spike down to tamp it down, but he forgot to put the wadding there. You're supposed to put some wadding so that it doesn't create a spark, which is what happened, which ignited the blasting powder, which then sent that spike through his handsome face. And in fact, you can see exactly where it entered close to his jaw, went up through his eye, up out the top of his head. This looks like it should be fatal, right? This probably should have killed him, but through some kind of miracle, he survived and then lived for a decade or two later. However, this did result in a profound change in his behavior. People, and these were, accounts of at the time, would say that, Phineas Gage used to be this very polite family man, very hardworking guy, And then after this injury, after he lost this part of his brain, he became very surly. He started drinking a lot. He would go to the bar and fight people. He had trouble holding jobs and things like that. And so people concluded, like, okay, this part of the brain must be responsible for your personality. It must be responsible for your sense of politeness and your sense of being able to inhibit violence and things like that. These things that Phineas Gage would have trouble with later in his life. I think now these days people look back at that and kind of wonder, is that true? Or maybe was he just kind of traumatized and some of his behaviors kind of look like PTSD? And so, we're now a little bit more cautious with the conclusions we draw from this one case study. But you get the idea that the brain is super important because when it's damaged, it impacts your behavior. If you're interested in Phineas Gage, I have a couple of video links at the very end of these slides where you can learn more about him. Neuroimaging used a lot these days in psychology and in cognitive neuroscience specifically. So neuroimaging, the premise behind it is that whenever your brain is active, it is going to, much like your muscles, whenever they are active, it is going to recruit a lot of blood. And if you recruit a lot of blood, because that blood is carrying oxygen, which is needed to help kind of power the brain and make sure that it can stay functioning, that if you can measure where that blood is, then you can measure what areas of the brain are more active. And if you can do that, then you can say, oh, well, I know that whenever I am concentrating on visual images, that this part of my brain is active, because when I did that, there was extra blood back there compared to when I was thinking about other things. So neuroimaging is way more inferential than I feel like the media usually kind of teaches us, right? When we see brain scans, we assume that that is the actual activation of those cells, which is not really true in a lot of cases. It is true with EEG. It is true with single cell recording devices, but for MRI and for PET scans, really what they're doing is they're actually measuring different levels of blood throughout the brain and then drawing inferences about what those areas are doing. So it's a little bit complicated, right? So magnetic resonance imaging, this is structural in nature. Whenever you get an MRI, what you're doing is you're just looking at the structure of the brain. When you're using functional magnetic resonance imaging, this is where you see stuff like this, these kinds of figures where you can see like, oh, this area had more blood in it than other areas. So therefore, this area of the brain must be involved in whatever the behavior is that this participant was doing at the time. So that's how you interpret that stuff. It's a little bit less concrete than I feel like a lot of people think that it is. Another common one that's used a lot these days is DTI, or diffuser tensor imaging. And this is not actually looking at blood, it's looking at water flow. So it's looking at what direction water is flowing through the brain. And this can tell us all kind of interesting things about the connected nature of the brain. So we can see what areas are connected with others. And occasionally you can find these really fascinating things like how, for example, meditation can actually change some of the direction that water flows throughout your brain whenever you are meditating. I already mentioned the central nervous system already. We know the spinal cord is here. The brainstem is really important for this. And in the brainstem, you're going to find other kind of deep brain structures like the medulla oblongata. You may have heard of that before. It's used for a lot of primitive emotions like anger. We see the pons, the midbrain, the reticular formation. These are going to be used for things like digestion, homeostasis, your heart beating, your ability to breathe, things like that. So very, very basic in nature. Here is a quick kind of division of the brain across the 4 different lobes. We have 4 lobes of the brain there, very important to know. We got the frontal lobe, We got the parietal lobe, we got the temporal lobe, and we got the occipital lobe. The frontal lobe is going to be, and so I remember this through an acronym of FPOT. I think I may have already even used that this semester as a joke, that the way to remember this is frontal, parietal, occipital, temporal. When it comes to having a good brain, don't do drugs. FPOT, right? So F standing for frontal, P standing for parietal, O standing for occipital, T standing for temporal. That gives you the clockwise order of these lobes. So the frontal lobe, this is going to be used for a lot of higher order behaviors, like concentrating on stuff, but reasoning, creativity, logic, decision making, things like that, imagination. The parietal lobe, this is going to be used for our sense of space, but also is going to be used for knowing what parts of our body are being touched, for example. The occipital lobe is going to be used almost exclusively for vision. It is used a lot for our ability to see. The temporal lobe is going to be used for a lot of hearing and a lot of speech as well. You can see speech is kind of on the bubble between the temporal lobe and the frontal lobe. And we'll talk about that a little bit more this semester as well. All right, so those lobes, I just went over those. There you go. The cerebellum, this is that area that looks, you don't even see it here, but the cerebellum is kind of like down here. It's that kind of broccoli looking structure that you see the brain resting on. The cerebellum is going to be used for a lot of primitive motor functions, like posture and balance. So your ability to kind of stand up straight and to not fall over, and to be able to walk in a straight line, that comes to us through our cerebellum. The limbic system. The limbic system is tricky because it has a couple of other structures in it, like the hippocampus. So the limbic system is kind of this structure that you see outlined right here. So these areas that are kind of close to the midbrain. Importantly for us, we're going to talk a lot about the amygdala and the hippocampus. The hippocampus because we're going to be talking a lot about memory this semester, and the amygdala because we're going to be talking a lot about fear and emotion. And when we talk about emotion, the amygdala is kind of one of the key players in that. So if you are disgusted at something, you're angry at something, you're scared of something, that's probably the amygdala helping us do that. The hippocampus is going to be the seat of memory. This is where memories are consolidated and where they are kind of spread out through the brain. One of the most widely cited studies in Psych 101 is the McGuire studies from over 20 years ago now, where basically they recruited a bunch of people in London, a bunch of London taxi drivers, and then a bunch of regular Londoners. And they gave them some MRI scans and looked at the structure of their brains, and they were fascinated because the London taxi drivers had different structure brains than the regular Londoner, and specifically the hippocampus. So the hippocampus being this part of the brain right here, was bigger. It had more surface area than people that were not taxi drivers. And the conclusion that they had here was it must be that with increased use of the hippocampus, that area of the brain grew. And I use grew in quotation marks here because this is an example of how when it comes to the brain, you either use it or you lose it. That areas of the brain, if you use them a lot, those areas are going to recruit neighboring neurons to help them in their mission. They're going to effectively grow in space. And so the hippocampus for these London cabbies were bigger because they had to, London taxi drivers, if you don't know about this, they are hardcore. Like, they can get you around London without looking at maps because they have to go through like this test where they ask you a bunch of questions about directions and you don't get a map. You have to know the layout of the city. And so if that's your day-to-day job where you have to try to remember all these directions and how to get from A to B throughout this really complex city, you're going to be using this area more than somebody who is using GPS to get from here to there in their cars. Fascinating study. You know, if you're interested, you can check it out. You can find lots of info about it on YouTube and elsewhere. I already mentioned the prefrontal cortex, but I wanted to highlight it here because the prefrontal cortex is used for a lot of what people think of as like exclusively human behaviors. I don't like that phrase because I feel like it's very human-centric. But if you're talking about like creativity or being aware of social norms and cooperating with others, that's handled in your prefrontal cortex. And the prefrontal cortex was the area that was often damaged using lobotomies in the 1940s and 50s. If you've heard of lobotomies before, basically and this is disgusting, I'm sorry to say, they would take like an ice pick and they would usually kind of put it behind your eye and then just kind of go like this, wiggle it back and forth to scramble a lot of the prefrontal cortex tissue back there. And that would usually result in hospital patients being much more docile and peaceful and cooperative because essentially parts of their personality were erased, which is extremely disturbing to think about. But lobotomies were used a lot in the 40s and 50s, so much so that people would travel around America kind of bragging about how fast they could administer lobotomies, and they would like essentially like traveling, trucks of these neurosurgeons would stop by these towns and be like, hey, does anybody need a lobotomy? Because I can do this in 5 minutes flat. Really weird, wild to think about. And then the final thing that I want to talk about for this chapter is synesthesia and phantom limbs. So the layout of the brain is important. We talked about that already when we were talking about phrenology, about how different areas of the brain do different things. But when it comes to our ability to sense our own bodies, that is also true. That you can see here that this is the layout of our bodies across our brain. So this would be like if I'm looking at the left hemisphere, this is the very internal middle part of the brain, and this is the outside portion of the brain, just to give you an idea of the layout here. And so you can kind of see the human body laid out, and it is proportional to how sensitive those areas are. So for example, the most sensitive parts of our body are going to be our fingertips and our lips. And wow, if you take, for example, the tips, if you take like a pencil and you stroke your fingertips, you can feel it very, very keenly. If you take that same thing and press it against your lip, you can also feel it even more. It's even more sensitive. And you can see that in the human brain that the areas that are largest, like our hands look huge on our on our brain because they are very sensitive areas. Likewise, our lips take up a huge part of the surface area of our brain because they are very sensitive. If we look at the areas that are not so sensitive, like your shoulder or your hip, those are not very sensitive areas, right? So think about it like this. If a spider was crawling on your lip, you would immediately know. If a spider was crawling on your back or on your shoulder, you might not know it immediately because we have different levels of sensitivity throughout. If I spent my time, and this is also, I can't go into, for the sake of time, I can't go into it here, but if you take sensation perception with me in another class, we talk about it there, that if you were to go blind and you were to start using Braille to read and to communicate with the world, that this area of your brain that is reserved for the index finger, which is used a lot, well actually all of your fingers are, but particularly your index finger, these areas of the brain are going to expand, where now you're going to see like, oh, the index finger is not just this slice right here. It's going to grow because we're using it more frequently, and we're using stuff with the eye a little bit less frequently. So we're going to kind of expand into those areas. So neurons can change with experience, which is what I was mentioning at the very beginning of this video. That as we use these things, you use it or you lose it. As you use these things more, that actually changes the layout of the brain. And I just kind of hopefully explained some of that stuff here. So if you were to, let's say, get into a motor vehicle accident and to lose your hand right here, you were to lose your hand at the wrist, your brain still exists in this part right here, right? Just because you don't have the hand, your brain's still around, it's still there, and it's looking for signals, it's looking for input. It's like, wait a second, now I'm no longer getting any kind of input from the hand. And occasionally it'll get some neural firing because other nearby neurons are firing, and so your brain might mistake that activation as being input from your missing hand. And that is referred to as phantom limb. If you've ever heard that before, phantom limb, it is because you're missing that part of your anatomy, and that part of your brain is still functioning, and your body will occasionally mistake that function with activation from your missing hand. So it feels like your hand is actually there, even though it was amputated years ago. Really wild stuff to think about. All right. Sorry, I did not mean to hit the microphone. We'll come back. I'll point out a video that I have that you might be interested in a little bit later for this. Just one of the many strange things about the brain. Here is another strange thing about the brain. As quickly as you can, look at this and tell me how many number 2s do you see here. Okay, I gave you a chance. Did you count them? How many are there? There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So there's 6 2s overall. If this was very easy, this could be very easy to some of you, and probably statistically it was easy for one of you, because one of you probably has synesthesia. Thinking about our class, synesthesia affects 1 in 20 people, which means that out of our class of about 20-25 people, we probably had at least one person where what they saw was something more like this, where whenever they saw these numbers, they involuntarily associated those numbers with colors so that those colors stuck out to you. And so here it's very easy to see 6, right? You see it immediately, and you immediately say, oh, there's 6 here. Whereas here, you kind of got to look and scan for that. So if you saw something more like this, where it immediately popped out at you, then you may have synesthesia. Synesthesia it's not a disorder, because it's not a bad thing, but it is a condition of the brain where you have sensory experiences that are interrelated that for most people are not related. So this is where we have sensory experiences that involuntarily affect others. So for me, if I see a number and I involuntarily associate that number, I see a color associated with it. So if I saw the number 2 and I saw it as purple, as you can see here, that's an example of synesthesia. And whenever I see a 3, I automatically see a blue aura around it, and I see 4 and I see a green aura around it. And that's true for every time I see a 2, a 3, or a 4. That's an example of synesthesia. That's a very common version of synesthesia. Like I said, 1 in 20 people have this kind of thing, this condition. That's the common version of it. There are less common versions of it, like my favorite example here, where this man said that he hated to drive because when he saw a road sign, it involuntarily tasted to him like a mixture of pistachio ice cream and earwax. You can imagine how disgusting that would be. And every time he saw it, he involuntarily felt like he had just tasted that. It was an automatic response of the brain. Why does this happen? It happens because, generally speaking, because of neural crosstalk. That is the phrase that you see thrown out a lot here, crosstalk. Where essentially these areas of the brain that for most people do not communicate with one another, do communicate for those that have synesthesia. So in the case of color grapheme synesthesia, which is this common version where you see numbers and you relate them to colors. That's because the area of the brain that is associated, that helps us kind of associate and recognize colors, is physically close to the area of the brain that helps us recognize numbers and other kinds of elements like letters. As you can see here, so the area of the brain that's responsible for detecting colors and for detecting graphemes, like numbers and letters, are really close to each other. And so for synesthesia, basically, you activate this area right here, and because of a couple of neurons that are connected over to this other area, for most people we don't have those connections, but for a select few of you, you may have this going on. Whenever this area is activated, it involuntarily activates the color area, and for that reason we perceive it as a color, when in fact we don't see, there's no actual color there, but we have color subjectively that we see automatically. All right, here I mentioned this when I was talking about phantom limb. This is from a super old textbook, but yeah, basically the idea is that, like, if you were to have, in this case, the hand amputated, that area of the brain is still active. And what happens is that these neighboring areas are going to grow to take up that real estate that is no longer being used. And what happens whenever this process occurs is that now, as you can see, the face, these parts of the face are now going to start growing into this part of the brain, and the shoulder and head are going to start growing into this part of the brain. And so now, for people that are missing their hand, if you have them close their eyes and then you touch this part of their head, they can sometimes mistakenly feel like you're touching their amputated arm, because you are activating this part of the hand, this part of the brain that used to handle the hand, as you can see here, but now, because it's no longer being used, but parts of your face are being used, now we associate that sensation as coming from the limb that is not actually there. And that's called a phantom limb. All right, the last thing is this. Yeah, this is the last thing that I want to mention here is the Hebbian synapse. The Hebbian synapse is a really complex, process. In one of my senior level classes, we spent an entire week unpacking this slide right here, so we could talk about it a whole lot. But basically, the brain is constantly rewiring and changing itself, and the idea that if you don't use it, you will lose it is true when it comes to the brain. That if you don't use certain areas, then other areas that are being used are going to grow into and intrude upon those areas that are not being used. So thinking about folks that are blind, they're not using their visual cortex as much. And so what happens is that those areas that are not being used are then going to take on new functions. So if you have somebody who is blind and they are reading something using Braille, you will actually see activation in their visual cortex from reading Braille, because it's not being used, so they lost it, that functionality, and now the functions that are being used frequently are going to take it over. And this is what I mean about how, like, whenever you learn something, that your body experiences a change. That whenever you learn something, and it can be something profound, or it can be something very easy, or it can be something that was boring to you, and you experience that as you watch this video, that your brain is now different than it was before you watched this video. We'll talk more about those processes in chapter 6 when we talk about learning. But basically the gist of it is that the neurons that communicate throughout the brain, they change structure, they change shape depending on their use. If they are not used very much, those cells may die off. If they are used a lot, they're going to get streamlined, and they're going to get really good at communicating with neighboring cells. So if you use that part of your brain a lot, those areas are going to get streamlined and more efficient and better. They're going to fire more frequently and easily. You've heard of muscle memory before, right? You got a really complex password, you just close your eyes and you let your fingers do it and they type it out. You don't even have to think about it, right? That's an example of muscle memory. You've done it so many times that now your brain doesn't need a whole lot to do it. It can, you know, knock it out really, really quickly, almost reflexively. This change is referred to as neuroplasticity. If you've ever heard of anybody talk about this, it just means the brain's ability to rewire itself. And we do this all the time, every day. Our brain is constantly rewiring itself. It's not a big special thing. It's something that is very common. And the Hebbian synapse is named Hebbian because the guy who came up with this was a Canadian researcher named Donald Hebb. He's the one that really kind of discovered this and codified it and wrote about it. And so these behaviors that we do all the time become kind of automatic because those cells that maintain that behavior get really good at doing it, and they don't need a lot of help. They can do it pretty much automatically. So things like tying your shoe or riding a bike or playing an instrument that you do a lot get really easily because of this process. And then the phrase that researchers like, instead of neurons that fire together will wire together, which is what neuroplasticity is. If you are not using those areas of the brain, then they will say that neurons that don't sync lose link, which is just the opposite of what we're saying here. That if those neurons are not firing together, you're not using them together, that they will eventually grow apart, that they will not really interact that much with each other. It's much harder for them to interact with one another. Over time, they stop firing. So whenever your teacher told you, hey, the mind is a wonderful thing, you use it or you lose it, they were telling you the truth, that is true at a cellular level. So that is chapter 4. Now, I want to do something real quick here. I want to point out a couple of these videos here. So we've got some extra videos. I have some domesticated fox videos. I showed you this one, but if you want to look at another one that looks at a vlog where somebody has some foxes, you can check that out here. If you want to look at some more info about phineas gage, you can check those out here. And also, if you want to look at phantom limb pain and how it's treated using something called mirror therapy, you can check that out down here. If you want to learn about synesthesia and the ability to perceive numbers and colors interchangeably, I highly recommend these two videos. This one from Ted Ed is kind of a summary walkthrough. It's like 4 minutes long, really cool kind of summary of that area. But this other one has a testimonial from a mathematician. Actually, no, she's a biostatistician now, talking about her experience living with synesthesia. Up here we have some lesion studies with what happens to your brain whenever you damage areas responsible for speech. So they are kind of fascinating areas that you can see how we know what the brain does, what areas the brain do, because we can see what happens to behavior when these areas are damaged. And that is all that I have for this chapter. Now, if you wait 1 second, I will be right back with that book that I promised you I would go get. So 1 second, please. All right, so maybe you can see me a little bit better here. I'm not sure if you can. But so this is the book that I was telling you about, The Beautiful Brain by Santiago Ramon y Cajal. And inside of this, you just have tons of great, you can't really see it too well with this camera, but you got tons of great images that he drew out with his early works. Really cool stuff, and you can even see the dude right here. Check him out. What a Chad. All right, thank you so much for tuning in, and if you have any questions, feel free to email me. Thanks so much for tuning in, and I will catch you next time. Bye bye.